My name is Jamie Harper. I'm 29 years old, and if I'd known what I was getting myself into, I would have never stepped foot in Mendocino National Forest that summer. I wish I could say this was just a bad camping trip or that I'm overreacting, but I know what I saw out there and I know I'll never forget it. It started with a text from Chris. He was 32, my college friend turned pseudo-survivalist, who loved to organize these adventures that always sounded better in theory than in practice. "We'll hit Mendocino," he wrote. "Off-the-grid hiking, real wilderness. You in?" I wasn't sure, honestly. Life in the city had been wearing me down, and maybe Chris's wild idea was what I needed. Sam, our mutual friend, was going too, so I agreed. I figured 3 days out in nature would help me clear my head. I had no idea it'd be the most harrowing 3 days of my life. Chris drove, naturally, with Sam and me crammed into the back of his beat-up Jeep, which towed a small RV. He regaled us with tales of his expert survival skills while I rolled my eyes. Sam, always the peacekeeper, sat between us and grinned like everything was fine. We reached the trailhead by midday. The forest was massive, the kind of green that swallows sunlight whole. Chris handed us a map he'd printed from some forum, the ink smudged and barely legible. "This is the route," he said, pointing. 3 days in, 2 nights camping. Easy. We hiked a few miles before setting up camp near a clearing. I wasn't thrilled with the old tent Chris brought. It smelled like mildew, but I didn't complain. After dinner, we sat around a fire, laughing and sharing stories. It felt normal, until the woods got too quiet. The sounds of birds and insects disappeared, leaving only the crackling fire. I felt a chill creep up my spine as the wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest stench, like something dead. "Smell that?" I asked. Chris shrugged. "Probably an animal. Relax." Sam nodded, but I could see him tense up. We all pretended nothing was wrong and went to bed, but I barely slept. I thought I heard something. Branches snapping in the distance, faint and deliberate. The next morning, the stench was worse. It hung in the air like a warning. I asked Chris if we should turn back. "No way," he said. "We've come this far. Don't chicken out." A few hours into the hike, we found an abandoned campsite. Tents shredded, food containers scattered, and claw marks gouged into the tree trunks. Sam stepped closer to inspect. "These aren't bear marks," he murmured. "They're something else." Chris waved him off. "Probably some idiot trying to scare people. We're fine." But I wasn't so sure. My gut told me to leave. And yet, like an idiot, I followed Chris deeper into the forest. By nightfall, the air was cold and damp. We set up camp near a ridge, but something felt wrong. The wind carried a sound, distant, faint, like a scream. It echoed off the trees, making it impossible to tell where it came from. "It's an animal," Chris said, though he didn't sound convinced. I wanted to believe him, but Sam's face told a different story. He was pale, gripping his flashlight like a lifeline. I woke to chaos. Our food supplies had been raided, containers ripped open, wrappers scattered. "What the hell?" I hissed, scanning the area. "No way this was an animal," Sam said, pointing to a trail of elongated footprints leading into the woods. The prints looked human, but wrong. Too long, with sharp indentations like claws. Chris, always too cocky for his own good, grabbed his knife. "Whatever it is, we're not running." But by midday, the forest itself seemed to close in. The towering pines felt suffocating, their branches blocking out the sun. The air grew heavy, and the smell of rot became unbearable. That night, as we sat in silence around the fire, I noticed Chris staring into the woods. His hand trembled as he pointed. "Do you see that?" I followed his gaze. At first, I saw nothing. Then it stepped into view. A figure stood among the trees, its body skeletal and impossibly thin. Antlers rose from its head, glinting in the firelight. Its eyes glowed, and when it opened its mouth, the stench of decay rolled over us. It spoke, not in words, but in sounds, guttural and mocking. Chris froze. It's not real. But it was. The creature didn't move at first. It just stared, its glowing eyes fixed on us. Then, slowly, it began to circle the campsite, its footsteps crunching the underbrush. Sam panicked, grabbing my arm. "We have to go, now!" We ran, leaving the fire behind, stumbling through the dark forest. The creature followed, its guttural noises growing louder, echoing around us. Chris lagged behind, yelling for us to wait, then he screamed. I turned back just in time to see the creature drag Chris into the shadows. His screams cut off, replaced by a sickening crunch. I wanted to help, but Sam yanked me forward. "There's nothing we can do." We kept running until we found a hollowed tree trunk and squeezed inside. My breath came in ragged gasps as we huddled together, trying to stay silent. Outside, the creature prowled, sniffing the air. Its growls vibrated through the hollow wood, but it didn't find us. Sam whispered something about folklore he'd read. "It's a wendigo," he said. "It feeds on desperation and greed. We need to burn something sacred." I remembered the bundle of sage I'd taken from the abandoned campsite, purely out of curiosity. With shaking hands, I pulled it from my pack and lit it. The smoke filled the hollow tree, and the creature let out a deafening screech. The ground trembled as it retreated into the woods, its glowing eyes disappearing. By dawn, we stumbled out of the forest, filthy and exhausted. There was no sign of Chris, just his torn jacket snagged on a tree branch. Sam and I agreed never to speak of what happened, but the memories linger. Sometimes at night, I hear those guttural growls in my dreams. And sometimes, when I wake, I smell that stench of decay hanging in the air like a warning. Whatever lives in Mendocino National Forest isn't human, and it isn't done with me yet. My name is Evelyn Parker, and I'm 34 years old. I've spent the past year traveling California in my RV, trying to rebuild my life and career as a travel blogger. This story happened last summer, on the slopes of Mount Shasta, and though I've tried to forget it, the memories won't leave me. Mount Shasta has always been a hotspot for strange stories. Lost civilizations, portals to other dimensions, and whispers of hauntings. I thought those were just tall tales. I was wrong. I just arrived at Panther Meadows, a serene, isolated clearing on Mount Shasta, known for its alpine beauty and spiritual significance. The late afternoon sun bathed the meadow in golden light as I parked my RV at the edge of the woods. It was picturesque, perfect for the kind of content that would bring my blog back to life. I grabbed my camera and wandered, snapping photos of wildflowers and the jagged peaks looming overhead. On my way back, I stopped at a gas station in town to refuel. That's where I met Mara. She was a wiry woman in her 60s, with piercing gray eyes and a quiet intensity. She noticed my camera and RV keys and asked, "You camping up there?" "Yeah, just a few days," I said. "It's beautiful." Her expression turned serious. "Panther Meadows is sacred ground. You respect it, hear me? Don't take anything, don't leave trash. And whatever you do, don't go off the trails." I smiled politely, dismissing her words as local superstition. Of course. Her hand gripped mine as I turned to leave. "They're still watching. The old ones. Don't make them angry." Her warning lingered, even as I laughed it off. Stories like that made great material for my blog. Mount Shasta, a hotspot for folklore and mysteries. The title wrote itself. That night, the meadow was eerily silent. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness. I tried to sleep, but the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. Around midnight, I heard it. Faint whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound grew clearer. It wasn't random, it was my name. Evelyn! I shot upright in bed, heart pounding. The whisper came again, soft and drawn out as if spoken directly into my ear. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the RV, but nothing was out of place. The whispers stopped as suddenly as they'd started. It's just your imagination, I told myself. I'd been alone too long, that's all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't. The next morning, I brushed off the night's events and set out to explore. I found a small path leading deeper into the woods, surrounded by towering pines. Perfect for photos. But as I walked, I noticed oddities. A pile of sticks arranged in a circular pattern, stones stacked unnaturally high, claw-like scratches on tree trunks. My stomach churned. I reached an ancient-looking tree at the trail's end, its gnarled branches stretching skyward like bony fingers. Hanging from one of the branches was a crude necklace made of animal bones. It swung slightly, though the air was still. I raised my camera to snap a photo, but a sharp gust of wind blew through, scattering leaves and making the necklace sway violently. A shiver ran down my spine. This wasn't just nature. Someone, or something, was here. Back at camp, I found strange symbols scratched into the dirt around my RV. They looked like spirals and jagged lines, almost like runes. I felt a sudden urge to leave, but pride kept me rooted. I wasn't about to run just because of a few spooky stories. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder, more insistent, overlapping in a chaotic symphony. I bolted out of bed, clutching my flashlight. Outside, the air was thick with fog, swirling in unnatural patterns. A shadow moved at the edge of the clearing. I froze. It was a woman. No, not a woman, something pretending to be one. Her figure was gaunt, her dress tattered, her eyes hollow pits of blackness. "Evelyn," she whispered, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves, "you've taken too much." I backed into the RV, locking the door. My heart thundered as I watched her through the window. She didn't approach, just stood there, watching. Then she raised a skeletal hand and pointed at the ground. The symbols around my RV began to glow faintly. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I was ready to leave. I packed quickly, tossing my gear into the RV, but when I tried to start the engine, it wouldn't turn over. I checked the battery. It was fine. The gas tank was full. Still, the RV refused to start. It was as if the mountain itself wouldn't let me leave. Desperate, I grabbed my map and decided to hike back to town. But no matter which path I took, I always ended up back at my campsite. The symbols in the dirt seemed to mock me, shifting subtly every time I returned. I started to panic. The air grew colder, and the forest felt alive, closing in around me. The whispers followed me wherever I went. Shadows danced in my peripheral vision, but when I turned, there was nothing there. By dusk, I realized I couldn't escape. My only option was to confront whatever was keeping me here. Mara's warning echoed in my mind. Respect the land. Don't take anything. Don't make them angry. I remembered the necklace of bones I'd seen near the ancient tree. It wasn't just decoration. It was an offering. Digging through my pack, I found the bundle of sage I'd brought for a photo prop. It was the only thing I had that felt remotely sacred. With trembling hands, I lit the sage and carried it to the center of the clearing. The fog thickened as I knelt, placing the sage on a flat stone. My camera, a symbol of my ambition and the reason I'd come here, followed. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't mean to disrespect you. Please, let me go." The witch appeared again, emerging from the fog like a phantom. She looked at the offering, then at me, her hollow eyes unblinking. Slowly, she nodded. "You've taken too much," she said again, her voice softer now. "Leave it behind." The fog lifted. The whispers stopped. When I returned to the RV, the engine roared to life on the first try. I didn't look back as I drove down the mountain, the symbols and shadows fading into the distance. Back in town, I spotted Mara outside the gas station. She smiled faintly and gave a small wave as if she knew exactly what had happened. That night, I wrote a blog post about Mount Shasta. Not about the witch, but about the beauty of the land and the importance of respecting it. My camera was gone, left behind as a peace offering, but I didn't care. Some things are more important than ambition. I haven't been back to Mount Shasta since. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see her hollow gaze and hear the whispers in the wind. I don't know if I'll ever forget, but I've learned to listen, to the land, to the warnings, and to the stories that carry more truth than we're willing to admit. My name is Liam Carter, and I'm 42 years old. I spent my life running into burning buildings as a firefighter, but nothing prepared me for what happened last summer at Devil's Postpile. I'd left my home in San Francisco a year earlier, hoping that living on the road in my RV would somehow help me outrun my grief. My wife, Emily, had died in a car accident, and the guilt of surviving when she didn't was eating me alive. I thought solitude might bring me peace. Instead, it brought me here. I arrived at Devil's Postpile National Monument on a bright, crisp afternoon in late June. The basalt columns rose like a fortress wall, their hexagonal shapes looking too precise to be natural. I'd come to see it for myself, to capture the kind of photos I knew Emily would have loved. I parked my RV in a remote lot a few miles from the main trail, far from the hum of other campers. Solitude had become a habit by then, a way of shielding myself from reminders of the life I used to have. At the visitor center, I met Sophia, a geologist who introduced herself with a warm smile. She was slender, with sun-worn skin and a voice that hinted at curiosity. "First time here?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "It's on my list of places to see." "Be careful," she replied, her tone shifting to something quieter. "This place has history." "What kind of history?" I asked, half joking. "Ghost stories?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Something like that. Just stay on the trails, and whatever you do, don't visit the post pile at night." "Why not?" Her smile faltered. "It's better if you don't find out." That night, as I lay in my RV, I couldn't stop thinking about Sophia's warning. Outside, the wind howled softly, brushing the pines against each other. The rhythmic creaking almost lulled me to sleep until I heard something else, a faint sound like footsteps crunching on gravel. My breath caught as I strained to listen. It stopped. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but the lot was empty. Just shadows and trees swaying in the wind. I locked the door and told myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I hiked to the post pile with my camera slung over my shoulder. The basalt columns were mesmerizing, their dark faces catching the sunlight in geometric patterns. But as I moved closer, something felt off. There were cracks running through the columns, glowing faintly as if the stone held embers deep within. I knelt to touch the surface, but it was cold. The heat was an illusion, or so I told myself. I snapped a few photos and tried to shake the unease. On my way back, I noticed footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. These were deep, unnaturally large, and pointed straight toward the postpile. I followed them until they disappeared into the tree line. Back at the RV, I saw something new. Strange symbols scratched into the dirt around my campsite. Spirals, jagged lines, and what looked like a humanoid figure. The symbols hadn't been there before. Just kids messing around, I muttered, though I didn't believe it. I thought about finding Sophia, but when I asked the park staff about her, they gave me blank looks. "We don't have anyone by that name here," one said. That night, the air grew colder. I bundled up and tried to sleep, but dreams of Emily kept me tossing and turning. She called to me, standing atop the post pile, her arms outstretched. "Liam," she said, her voice soft but commanding. "Come find me." I woke drenched in sweat. The wind outside had died, replaced by an eerie stillness. Then I heard it, the crunch of footsteps again, this time heavier, deliberate. My flashlight flickered as I peered outside. That's when I saw it. A shadowed figure stood at the edge of the clearing, towering and broad. Its body looked like it was made of stone, with glowing cracks running along its limbs and chest. It didn't move, but its presence felt suffocating. I locked the door and backed away, my hands shaking. The figure didn't approach, but it didn't leave either. It just stood there, watching. By morning, the figure was gone, but the air still felt heavy. I packed up, ready to leave, but when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The RV wouldn't start, though I'd checked the battery and gas the day before. "Fine," I said aloud, grabbing my map. "I'll hike out." I followed the trail I'd come in on, but after what felt like hours, I ended up back at my campsite. No matter which direction I went, I always looped back. The symbols scratched in the dirt seemed to mock me, shifting slightly every time I returned. Frustrated and scared, I yelled into the forest. "What do you want from me?" The air grew colder. A low rumble echoed through the trees, shaking the ground. The figure emerged from the woods, closer now, its basalt skin shimmering in the light. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and a voice thundered in my mind. "You carry grief. It poisons the land. Leave it behind, or join the stone." The figure chased me to the base of the post pile, its glowing cracks pulsing with heat. I stumbled, falling to my knees, as it loomed over me. Its voice filled my head again, louder this time. "You have taken too much. Give it back." I thought of Sophia's warning about respecting the land. Then I thought of Emily, of the guilt that had driven me here. I realized the sentinel wasn't just a guardian, it was a judge, and it had found me guilty. Digging into my pocket, I pulled out my wedding ring. It was all I had left of Emily, a constant reminder of the life I couldn't let go of. With shaking hands, I placed it on the ground. "This is all I have," I said. "Take it." The sentinel froze, its cracks dimming. It reached down, its massive stone hand brushing the ring. The glow faded entirely, and the figure stepped back, retreating into the shadows. When I woke, the sun was rising. The air felt lighter, the forest alive with the sound of birds. My RV started on the first try, and the symbols in the dirt were gone. As I drove out of the park, I saw a basalt stone sitting on my dashboard, faintly glowing. A gift or a warning, I wasn't sure. I haven't been back to Devil's Post Pile since. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear the low rumble of the sentinel's voice, reminding me of the grief I left behind, and the life I still have to live. My name is Mia Torres, and I was 31 when this happened. I've always been the kind of person who sought solace in nature when life got messy, and after my breakup I needed solitude more than ever. That's why I packed my RV and headed to Big Sur, hoping to lose myself in the towering redwoods and the salty ocean air. What I found there wasn't peace. It was something far darker, something that still haunts me. It was mid-October, the off-season for tourists, so Pfeiffer Big Sur State Park was quieter than usual. I pulled my RV into a small, secluded campsite surrounded by redwoods, far from the main campground. This was supposed to be my escape, my chance to clear my head and focus on my photography. I had 3 days to spend with nothing but my camera, my thoughts, and the forest. The first day was uneventful. I spent the morning hiking along one of the easier trails, capturing the light filtering through the redwoods. The golden beams slicing through the canopy were breathtaking. By sunset, I was back at my campsite reviewing the photos. They were stunning, but a few made me pause. In some shots, faint shapes lingered in the background. Childlike figures that didn't make sense. I brushed it off, blaming the dappled light and my overactive imagination. That evening, I decided to explore a nearby spot I'd read about online, an old wooden bridge deep in the forest. It was a short hike from my campsite, and I wanted to catch the golden hour light for a perfect shot. The bridge was straight out of a fairy tale, overgrown with moss and framed by massive redwoods. But as I lined up my shot, I noticed something, or rather someone, standing just beyond the bridge. It was a child, a boy no older than 8, wearing old-fashioned clothes that looked straight out of a black and white photograph. He was barefoot, his face pale, and his dark eyes locked onto mine. Before I could say anything, he turned and ran into the woods. "Hey, wait!" I called, instinctively following. I didn't go far before stopping myself. The forest was dense, and the child had disappeared so quickly it was almost unnatural. Unease settled in my stomach as I realized how quiet it had gotten. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness. I hurried back to my RV, telling myself I'd imagined the whole thing. That night, I couldn't sleep. My dreams were restless, filled with images of pale children wandering through the woods. When I woke, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like the wind brushing through the trees. But soon, I could make out words. "Help us," a soft voice said. I sat up, my heart pounding. It sounded like a child, but I was alone. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out the RV window. The trees stood silent, their twisted shapes casting long shadows in the moonlight. There was no one there. The whispers continued throughout the night, growing louder and more insistent. They weren't just outside. I could swear they were inside my head. The next morning, I was packing my camera gear when a knock at my RV door startled me. Standing outside was a man in a park ranger uniform, his face weathered and serious. "Morning," he said. "Name's David Brooks, just checking in. You're a little off the main campground here." "I like the quiet," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. David nodded but didn't seem convinced. His eyes scanned the trees around my site. "Just be careful. This part of the forest has a reputation." "What kind of reputation?" I asked, half joking. He hesitated. "People say it's haunted. Back in the 1930s, several children went missing around here. They were never found. Some folks believe their spirits linger." I felt a chill run down my spine, but forced a laugh. "Ghost stories, huh?" David didn't smile. "Just stay on the trails and avoid the old bridge after dark." Ignoring David's warning, I returned to the bridge later that afternoon. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I needed to find. As I explored, I noticed something half buried near the bridge, a small leather-bound journal. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with shaky handwriting. The entries were written by a child named Lucy, She wrote about hearing voices in the trees and seeing a man with hollow eyes who promised to take her and the other children to a better place. The last entry made my blood run cold. He says we have to stay here forever. I miss my mommy. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I began hearing whispers again. This time, they were louder, more urgent. "Help us, Mia," they said, using my name. Shaking, I looked up and saw them. 3 pale children standing at the edge of the bridge. Their eyes were wide, their faces blank. They reached out to me, their voices pleading. "Stay with us. Please, we're so lonely." Something about their tone twisted my gut. Their voices were sad, but there was a hunger behind them, an unnatural pull. "I can't," I whispered, backing away. The children's faces contorted, their features twisting into something grotesque. Their hollow eyes burned into me as they stepped closer. I turned and ran, the whispers following me. They weren't just in my ears now, they were in my head, clawing at my thoughts. The trees seemed to close in around me, the forest twisting and turning until I could no longer tell which direction I'd come from. When I finally stumbled back to the RV, the children were waiting. Their hands pressed against the windows, their pale faces peering inside. "Don't leave us, Mia," they said in unison. Their voices were hollow, echoing like 1,000 cries at once. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking. When I shone it at them, they shrieked and vanished into the darkness. Desperate, I grabbed the journal and flipped through its pages, searching for anything that could help. One entry stood out. "Light keeps him away. He hates the light." I didn't know who he was, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I started the RV, praying it would cooperate. As the engine roared to life, the whispers grew deafening. The children reappeared, their forms flickering like static, and began pounding on the windows. I turned on every light I had, headlights, interior lights, even my camera flash. The bright bursts seemed to push them back, their screams echoing through the forest. I drove through the night, not stopping until I was miles from Big Sur. The whispers faded as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, but their words stayed with me. "You'll come back. They always do." I never did. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear them. The faint whispers of children lost in the trees, calling my name. My name is Derek Evans. I was 36 years old when this happened, and to this day, I wish I'd trusted my gut and stayed far away from the Lost Coast Trail. I've spent years living off the grid, camping, hiking, and documenting my adventures for a niche YouTube channel. The wilderness was my escape, a place where I felt in control. But what I encountered on that trail, what I barely survived, was a reminder that some places are better left untouched. It was late September when I decided to hike a stretch of the Lost Coast Trail, a rugged, isolated slice of California coastline. The idea was to test my survival skills and capture the beauty of the trail for my channel. My RV served as a base camp, and I planned to hike out each day, returning at night to edit footage and rest. The first day was uneventful, though the terrain was tougher than I expected. The trail twisted through dense forests and rocky beaches, with towering cliffs on one side and the roaring ocean on the other. There were no people, no cell service, just me, the wind, and the waves. Midway through the hike, I stumbled upon an abandoned campsite. At first glance, it seemed like someone had left in a hurry. A torn tent flapped in the breeze, and scattered belongings littered the ground. As I got closer, I noticed something disturbing. Streaks of what looked like dried blood on the rocks. A chill ran down my spine. Animals, I told myself. Probably a bear or a mountain lion. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, as I sat editing my footage in the RV, I heard faint rustling outside. It wasn't unusual. Raccoons or deer often wandered near campsites. But when I checked, there was nothing there. Just the trees, their branches swaying in the wind. I went to bed uneasy. The next morning, I decided to hike further along the trail. The fog rolled in thick, and the eerie silence of the forest pressed down on me. By midday, I spotted someone on the trail, a woman, alone, walking toward me. She looked disheveled, her clothes torn and covered in dirt. Her eyes darted nervously, and when she saw me, she nearly collapsed. "Are you okay?" I asked, rushing to her. "I've been lost," she said, her voice trembling. "For days. My group, we got separated." Her name was Claire, and she claimed she'd been hiking with friends when they were attacked by something in the woods. Her story was fragmented, full of half-finished sentences and vague descriptions. She refused to say what exactly had attacked them, only that it wasn't an animal. Against my better judgment, I offered to help her. She seemed terrified, and I couldn't leave her out there alone. As we walked back toward my RV, the unease grew. The trees seemed darker, the air heavier. Claire kept glancing over her shoulder, muttering about how they were watching us. When I pressed her for details, she clammed up. Around dusk, we reached a clearing where I planned to camp for the night. While gathering firewood, I noticed strange markings on the trees, crude carvings of human figures and symbols I didn't recognize. Claire saw them too and froze. "We're in their territory," she whispered. "Whose territory?" I asked, but she just shook her head. That night, the noises started. Low, guttural laughter echoed through the forest, faint but unmistakable. I tried to tell myself it was animals, but Claire's wide-eyed panic said otherwise. The next morning, Claire finally opened up. Her group had camped near the trailhead, but were lured deeper into the forest by strange noises, cries for help, laughter, whispers. They'd stumbled upon what she described as a village, though it sounded more like a cluster of makeshift huts. That's when they saw them. Gaunt, feral people with hollow eyes and skeletal frames. They moved like animals, Claire said, and they attacked without warning. She barely escaped, leaving her brother behind. I wanted to dismiss her story as paranoia or shock, but the evidence was mounting. The footprints around my RV, the blood at the abandoned campsite, the strange laughter. It all fit. We had to leave. We packed quickly and set off toward my RV, but the forest felt different. The trails twisted in ways they hadn't before, and the trees seemed to close in around us. Claire grew increasingly frantic, insisting we were being followed. I didn't want to believe her, but I could feel it too, the weight of unseen eyes on my back. As night fell, we stumbled into a clearing. At first, I thought it was another campsite, but then I saw the bones. Human bones, scattered among the remains of makeshift shelters. Skulls hung from the trees, and the ground was littered with rusted tools and weapons. The stench of decay was overpowering. Then we heard them. A guttural growl, followed by rustling in the bushes. Figures emerged from the shadows, their bodies emaciated, their faces twisted with hunger. They wore scraps of clothing and bones as jewelry, and their teeth were sharp, broken from the years of gnawing. "They found us," Claire whispered. We ran, crashing through the forest as the cannibals pursued us. They moved faster than seemed humanly possible, their guttural cries echoing through the trees. My lungs burned, and Claire stumbled behind me, barely keeping up. At one point, I turned to shine my flashlight at them, hoping to disorient them. The light caught their faces, pale, filthy, with hollow eyes that glinted like animals in the beam. They flinched, but didn't stop. Finally, We reached the RV. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as the cannibals closed in. Just as one lunged, I got the door open and dragged Claire inside. I locked the door and started the engine, slamming the gas pedal to the floor. As we sped down the narrow dirt road, the cannibals chased us, their howls fading as the RV picked up speed. I didn't stop until we were miles away, the forest finally thinning into open terrain. Claire sat in the passenger seat, silent and trembling. We reached a small ranger station at dawn. I tried to explain what had happened, but the ranger looked at me like I was crazy. He said people sometimes get spooked on the trail, imagining things in the isolation. When I insisted, he shrugged and said, "The lost coast has its secrets." Claire disappeared after that night. I dropped her off at a bus station and she didn't say goodbye. I haven't heard from her since. As for me, I uploaded some of my footage to my channel, but I left out the worst parts. I couldn't bring myself to relive it. Sometimes, though, when I'm alone at night, I hear it again, that low, guttural laughter, and I wonder if they'll ever come looking for me. My name is Claire Matthews, and I was 29 years old when it happened. This was 3 years ago, in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, near a place called Lost Trail Campground. What I experienced there has haunted me ever since. I've told myself it couldn't have been real, but the memories, the sounds, the voices, refused to let me believe that. It started as a simple camping trip. Jake, my boyfriend of 3 years, suggested we take a weekend away to reconnect. Things had been rocky between us, and I thought it was a great idea. I invited my friend Naomi Hernandez to join us. She was new to hiking and eager to get out of her comfort zone. The plan was simple: spend 2 nights camping, hike some trails, and just unwind. Jake wanted something off the beaten path, away from the crowded campsites. He found a place called Lost Trail, far enough from civilization to promise peace and quiet. It was supposedly part of an old mining area, but all I could find online were vague mentions of unmarked trails and warnings about getting lost. We packed light, maybe too light. Naomi's hiking boots were brand new, stiff and unbroken, and Jake didn't bother checking his tent beforehand. The zipper was busted, which we discovered only after arriving. But Jake, ever the optimist, waved it off. "It's camping," he said. "It's supposed to be rough." We arrived late Friday afternoon. The campground was almost deserted, just a couple of RVs parked at the far end of the lot. Beyond it, a dense wall of trees rose like a fortress, casting long shadows over the gravel lot. I felt a twinge of unease, but brushed it aside. It was probably just nerves. The first hike was fine. Naomi struggled a bit with her boots, and Jake kept pushing us to explore further off the marked trail. I protested, but Jake always had a way of brushing me off with his easy grin and charming confidence. "Live a little, Claire," he said. "You don't always need a map." By the time we returned to the campground, the sun was setting. The forest seemed darker than it should have been, the shadows deeper. We set up camp, had dinner, and sat around a fire Jake built. Naomi and I chatted while Jake wandered a few yards into the woods to scout the area. He came back a little pale. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah," he said, but his voice was tight. "Just thought I saw something, probably a deer." That night, I woke to a sound, something faint, like tapping or knocking. I sat up in the tent listening. The fire had died out, and the forest was pitch black. Jake was beside me, snoring softly. I told myself it was nothing and forced myself to go back to sleep. The next morning, Naomi discovered something unsettling near the campsite. A small pile of bones, meticulously arranged in a circle. They were too small to be anything dangerous. Rabbit bones, maybe, but it was enough to make my stomach turn. "Who would do this?" Naomi asked, her voice shaking. "Probably just a prank," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Kids messing around." We decided to hike again that day, sticking to a marked trail this time. The forest was beautiful, but eerily quiet. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just the sound of our boots crunching on dirt. After a few hours, we came across something that made me stop cold. A crude carving on a tree trunk, depicting a figure with elongated limbs and an animal-like head. Naomi snapped a picture, nervously joking about modern art. Jake didn't say anything. That night, the unease deepened. Naomi was the first to notice the drumming, faint, rhythmic beats coming from deep in the forest. It was almost too soft to hear, but once I focused on it, I couldn't ignore it. It stopped every time one of us spoke or moved. Later, while sitting around the fire, Jake's expression changed. His eyes darted to the trees and his face went pale. "Do you hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" I said. "Someone's calling my name." Naomi and I exchanged a nervous glance. "Jake, no one's—" "Shh," he snapped. He stood up, staring into the darkness. "It's coming from over there." "Jake, don't," I said, grabbing his arm. But he shrugged me off and stormed into the woods, calling, "Who's out there?" We followed reluctantly, flashlights cutting through the dark. I kept telling Jake to stop, that it wasn't safe, but he didn't listen. The drumming had started again, louder now, and I swore I could hear whispers beneath it. Then, in the distance, we heard it, a voice, Jake's voice. "Over here," it called, mimicking his tone exactly. "Help me." Jake froze. "What the hell?" The voice came again, this time closer. Naomi grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "That's not you," she whispered. "No," Jake said, his voice trembling. "It's not." We ran back to camp, but the trail seemed different, looping in ways it shouldn't have. By the time we found our tents, the fire had gone out completely, and the night seemed colder, the air heavier. Naomi was shaking, muttering to herself in Spanish. Then we heard the voice again, coming from the trees. "Help me, over here." It wasn't Jake's voice anymore. It was mine. We huddled in the tent, clutching flashlights like lifelines. Naomi wouldn't stop crying, and Jake sat silently, staring at the zipperless tent flap. I wanted to scream at him, to blame him for bringing us here, but I knew it wouldn't help. We needed to get out. At some point, we fell into a restless sleep. I woke to the sound of footsteps circling the tent. Slow, deliberate. Then came the voice. Soft, melodic, but wrong. "Claire, Jake, Naomi." I peeked through a small tear in the tent. What I saw will never leave me. A tall figure stood just beyond the fire pit, its limbs impossibly long and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its face was featureless, a smooth expanse of pale skin. It cocked its head as if sensing me, and I froze. "Do not speak to it," Naomi hissed, her voice low and urgent. The figure crouched, its body folding in on itself like a marionette, then slithered out of view. We stayed frozen, not daring to breathe, until the first rays of dawn broke through the trees. We packed in silence, our hands shaking. Jake insisted we go back to the trail, but no matter which direction we went, we ended up back at the campsite. It was late afternoon by the time Naomi stumbled across an old mining shack. Inside, she found a journal, its pages brittle with age. The writer spoke of a curse, of skinwalkers haunting the woods, luring people with mimicry and driving them mad. "Stay silent," the final entry read. "Do not look. Do not speak. It feeds on fear." Jake snapped. He screamed into the forest, demanding the thing show itself. When it did, standing just yards away, it looked like him, down to the smirk I had once loved. Naomi ran, disappearing into the trees. I never saw her again. I grabbed Jake, forcing him to follow me, but he was hysterical, sobbing and shouting at the thing. I ignored the mimicry, the whispers, the drumming, focusing only on putting one foot in front of the other. When we finally stumbled onto a paved road, the forest behind us fell silent. Jake collapsed, shaking. Naomi's body was never found. Jake and I broke up soon after. He refused to talk about what happened, and I didn't press him. I couldn't. I spent months researching Skinwalker legends, piecing together fragments of stories and warnings. Some nights I still hear the drumming, faint and rhythmic, echoing in my dreams. I haven't been camping since. My name is Marcus Reeves, and I was 42 when it happened. I'd just come out of a messy divorce and life felt like one big empty room. Too much space, too much silence. I decided to pack up my old RV and take it out to the Alabama hills in California. It was a place I'd heard about in a travel magazine. Rugged, isolated, and perfect for stargazing. That's what I told myself I was going for. The stars. But really, I just wanted to get away from everything. The Alabama hills sit at the base of the Sierra Nevada, all jagged rocks and sprawling desert. It's the kind of place where you can park your RV, step out, and not see another soul for miles. That's exactly what I needed. The first day was uneventful. I parked the RV off a dirt road, surrounded by towering boulders that looked like giant, ancient sculptures. I set up camp, pulled out my telescope, and spent hours scanning the sky. The stars were brighter out there, free from the city's glare. For the first time in months, I felt a strange kind of peace. That night, though, I heard something. It started as a faint hum, so soft I thought it was just the wind threading through the rocks. But as the night deepened, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind. It was voices. A distant choir, harmonizing in a language I couldn't place. The melody was beautiful, haunting, and utterly unnatural. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe some kind of auditory illusion. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the sound was coming from somewhere deliberate, like it had a purpose. The next morning, I shook off the unease and told myself to focus on the trip. I went for a hike among the rocks, taking in the otherworldly landscape. The silence was thick, almost oppressive. The only sounds were my boots crunching on gravel and the occasional rustle of a lizard darting between stones. That's when I found it. At the base of a massive boulder, there was a circle of rocks arranged in a spiral pattern. It looked deliberate, too precise to be random. In the center of the spiral, there were marks etched into the dirt, lines and symbols I didn't recognize. Something about it made my skin crawl. I took a few steps back, trying to convince myself it was just a campsite or some kind of art project. But as I turned to leave, I felt it. A cold breath of air on the back of my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing there. By the time I got back to the RV, the wind had picked up. It rattled the windows and howled through the cracks, making the whole vehicle shudder. I checked the weather forecast. Nothing unusual was predicted, but the wind felt wrong, like it was alive. I spent the rest of the afternoon reading and trying to ignore the unease gnawing at me. When the sun set, I locked the door, closed the curtains, and settled in for the night. That's when I noticed something odd. The RV wasn't where I'd parked it. I always parked with a clear view of Mount Whitney in the distance, but now the mountain was at a strange angle. I checked the tire marks. They were deeper than they should have been, like the RV had been dragged a few feet across the dirt. My first thought was that it was the wind, but how could wind move a 2-ton vehicle? I didn't have an answer. That night, the choir came back. Louder this time. The voices seemed to echo all around me, bouncing off the rocks and seeping through the walls of the RV. I turned on the exterior lights, hoping to scare off whatever it was. But when I looked out the window, I saw them. Figures. Shadowy and flickering, like they were made of smoke. They stood in the distance, clustered around the spiral of rocks I'd found earlier. I couldn't make out their faces, but I could feel their eyes on me. I locked the door and sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel like it could protect me. The voices kept singing, growing louder, pressing into my skull. They weren't speaking English or any language I recognized, but I understood their message. You are not welcome here. The third day, I decided to leave. I packed up my things, fired up the RV, and started down the dirt road. But no matter how far I drove, the landscape didn't change. The same boulders, the same spirals of rock, the same eerie silence. Then the visions started. I saw my ex-wife standing in the middle of the road, her arms crossed, glaring at me like she used to. "You left me," she said. Her voice was cold, accusatory. "You're good at that, aren't you, leaving people behind?" I slammed on the brakes, but she was gone. Just an empty road, stretching into the horizon. When I reached for the water bottle on the passenger seat, it wasn't there. Instead, there was a photograph. I recognized it immediately. It was from my days as a firefighter, taken after a fire that claimed 3 lives. A family. I had been the one to pull their bodies out of the rubble. I thought I'd lost the photo years ago, but here it was, sitting on my dashboard like a mocking reminder. The voices returned that night. The choir didn't just sing, they spoke. They whispered my name, accusing, mocking. "You let them burn," they said. "You let them die." That night, I found myself walking. I don't remember leaving the RV, but I was suddenly out in the open, the cold wind biting at my skin. The voices led me to an altar. A slab of stone carved with strange symbols surrounded by bones. Human bones. The figures were there, circling the altar, their shadows stretching impossibly long in the moonlight. One of them stepped forward, more solid than the others. Its shape flickered, shifting between human and something else. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its voice was a low hum that resonated in my chest. "You cannot leave," it said. "You belong to us." I don't know where I found the strength, but I forced myself to speak. "No," I said, my voice shaking. "You don't own me." The figure tilted its head, curious. The choir's song faltered as if they hadn't expected resistance. I took a step back, then another, and the figures advanced, their shapes twisting and writhing like smoke in a storm. I ran. The landscape seemed to shift around me, the rocks rearranging themselves to block my path. The voices grew louder, hammering against my skull, but I kept moving, focusing on the RV's distant lights. When I finally reached it, I slammed the door shut and started the engine. The RV roared to life, and I tore down the dirt road, not caring about the bumps and rocks. The figures didn't follow me, but the voices lingered, faint and accusing, until the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. When I finally reached civilization, I parked at a gas station and collapsed in the driver's seat, shaking. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? It's been 3 years since that trip, and I haven't been back to the Alabama hills or any other remote camping spot. I sold the RV and moved into a small apartment in the city where the noise of traffic drowns out the quiet. But some nights, when the world is still, I hear it, the faint hum of the choir calling my name, and I wonder if I ever really escaped. My name is Evelyn Carter, but everyone calls me Evie. I'm 34, and I make my living as a travel blogger. A glamorous life, right? At least, that's what my followers think. The truth is, it's a constant grind of editing, deadlines, and pretending to be cheerful even when you're exhausted. That's why, last spring, I decided to head to Lassen Volcanic National Park in California. I needed a break, some peace, and let's be honest, a killer video to boost my views. What I got instead, I still can't explain. I parked my RV at a remote campground on the edge of the park, miles from the main visitor center. It was perfect. No noisy tourists, no kids running around, just me and the wilderness. The landscape was otherworldly. Jagged volcanic rocks, steaming geothermal vents, and towering pines that seemed to whisper in the wind. I set up my camera gear and started filming. That first day went smoothly. I hiked to Bump-Ass Hell, a geothermal area filled with bubbling pools and sulfuric steam, and captured some amazing shots. By evening, I was sitting by the campfire reviewing footage. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest seemed to change. The trees cast long, spindly shadows, and the air grew unnaturally still. No birds, no crickets, nothing. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. That night, I heard it for the first time. A faint, echoing whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but when I turned off the RV's lights and listened, I realized it was words. Soft, unintelligible, but unmistakably human. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. The sun was shining and everything seemed normal again. I packed my drone and camera gear and headed out to film. My goal was to capture an aerial shot of a hidden lake I'd read about online. The hike was harder than I'd expected. The trail narrowed as it wound through dense trees, and my GPS kept glitching, showing me in places I knew I hadn't been. When I finally reached the lake, I felt a small surge of pride. It was stunning, surrounded by rocky cliffs and untouched by tourists. I launched my drone, eager to get a sweeping view. That's when things started going wrong. The drone climbed steadily, but as it hovered over the lake, the feed cut out. The screen on my controller went black, and a second later, I heard a splash. My stomach sank. I ran to the water's edge, but the lake was calm, the drone nowhere in sight. Furious, I packed up and started back, cursing my bad luck. On the way back, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A strange arrangement of rocks in a clearing. They formed a spiral, each stone placed with precision. At the center was a shallow hole filled with ash and charred wood. It looked like some kind of ritual site. I snapped a photo for the blog, but as I stood there, I felt watched. My skin prickled, and the air seemed to press against me, thick and suffocating. I backed away and hurried back to the RV, my heart pounding. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time. They came from outside, circling the RV like an invisible crowd. I peeked through the blinds but saw nothing, just darkness. The third day, I decided to explore a lesser-known trail that wound past fumaroles and steaming vents. I needed footage to salvage the trip, and the geothermal activity would make for great content. As I walked, I noticed the forest growing unnaturally quiet again. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. Then, at the edge of my vision, I saw it. A figure standing among the trees. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its posture unnatural. I froze, staring, but when I blinked, it was gone. Just the empty forest. By now, my nerves were shot. I returned to the RV, locked the doors, and tried to distract myself with editing. But when I played back the footage from the day, I noticed something chilling. In the shot of the fumaroles, a faint silhouette flickered in the background, barely visible but unmistakably there. I replayed the clip, zooming in, but the figure didn't look human. It was gaunt, skeletal, with elongated limbs and no face. My hands were shaking as I paused the video. That's when I heard my voice, my own voice, coming from outside. "Help me!" it called, faint and trembling. "Please, help me!" I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, my heart pounding. The beam swept across the dark forest, but there was no one there. Then, just at the edge of the light, I saw it. A shadow, tall and thin, stepping out from behind a tree. Its body seemed to flicker, like it wasn't entirely solid. It tilted its head, mimicking my movements exactly. I slammed the door and locked it, retreating to the back of the RV. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with a warped, guttural tone. My flashlight flickered and I felt the RV shake as though something was pressing against it. I don't know why I did it. Maybe the whispers compelled me, but I grabbed my gear and bolted into the forest. The shadow followed, gliding silently between the trees. I ran until I reached the clearing with the spiral of rocks. The center of the spiral glowed faintly now, the ash pit alive with a dim, otherworldly light. As I stepped closer, the shadows gathered around me, forming a loose circle. They didn't attack. They just stood there, flickering and watching. I realized then what they wanted: fear. The more afraid I became, the stronger they grew. I had to fight back. Desperate, I rummaged through my backpack and found a small emergency flare. I lit it, the red light cutting through the darkness, and the shadows recoiled. Their flickering forms grew dimmer, their movements slower. I tossed the flare into the ash pit, igniting the remaining wood. The fire roared to life, and the shadows screamed, not with voices, but with a terrible, high-pitched hum that vibrated in my chest. One by one, they dissolved into the night. By dawn, I made it back to the RV, exhausted and trembling. I packed up and left the park, driving until I reached a crowded gas station where I could finally breathe. I uploaded my footage that day, raw and unedited, as a warning to anyone who might venture too far off the beaten path. The video went viral, but I didn't care. I haven't gone camping since, and I don't think I ever will. Some nights, though, I still hear the whispers, faint and distant, and I wonder if the hollow ones are waiting for me to return. My name is Sarah Grant, and this happened in the summer of 2023. I'm not one to share ghost stories or paranormal tales, but what my family experienced at Mount Shasta is something I can't forget. Maybe writing it down will help me make sense of it, or at least warn someone else to stay away. It was my husband Tom's idea to go camping there. He's 37, a history buff who thrives on adventure and loves chasing old legends. He'd read about the myths surrounding Mount Shasta, theories about lost civilizations, UFOs, even a cursed witch. I didn't take any of it seriously. I agreed to the trip because I thought it would be good for our kids, Lucas and Maya, to disconnect from screens and spend some time outside. Lucas, our 12-year-old, is quiet and serious. He's into coding and gaming, a kid with his head in the clouds but his feet firmly on the ground. Mia, on the other hand, is our little dreamer. At 8 years old, her imagination runs wild, and she has this way of making you believe in her fantasies, at least for a moment. We arrived on a bright Friday morning, the sun glinting off the rugged volcanic rocks as we drove up a winding dirt road to our campsite. The ranger who checked us in warned us to avoid unmarked trails and caves. "Weather changes quickly up here," she said, her face unusually grave. "And there are stories. Just stay safe." Tom chuckled it off, but something about her tone gave me goosebumps. The first day was uneventful. We pitched our tent, a frustrating process due to a faulty zipper, and cooked hot dogs over a small campfire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air turned icy. I zipped my jacket and huddled closer to the fire. Tom brought out his favorite topic, the legends of Mount Shasta. "Did you know some people think this place is a portal to another dimension?" he asked, his eyes glinting in the firelight. Lucas rolled his eyes, and I shot Tom a look that said enough. But Mia? She was transfixed. Later that night, as I lay awake in our lopsided tent, I heard faint whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling the trees. But the longer I listened, the clearer it became. Words. My name. Sarah. I froze, holding my breath, convinced I was imagining things. I must have fallen asleep eventually, but when I woke the next morning, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling. Things began to change on the second day. We hiked to a small clearing Tom had read about, dotted with ancient-looking boulders. Some of these might be from old Native American rituals, he explained, running his hands over the smooth surface of one stone. That's when Mia tugged on my sleeve. "Mommy, look what I found." She held up a jagged, rusted dagger. Its handle was wrapped in something that looked like sinew. "Put that down, Mia," I said sharply. But Tom examined it with fascination, slipping it into his pack. "It's probably an artifact," he said, grinning. I had half a mind to leave it behind, but Tom wouldn't hear of it. That afternoon, Lucas started recording bird calls on his phone, one of his random hobbies. Later, he played back the audio and frowned. "That's weird," he muttered. "What is?" I asked, leaning over. He played it again, and I heard what sounded like a woman humming softly. "I didn't hear that when I was recording," Lucas said, his voice low. "It wasn't there." That night, Mia started acting strange. After dinner, she wandered away from the campsite, her small figure vanishing into the twilight before we realized she was gone. We found her sitting on a rock about 50 feet away, humming the same tune Lucas had recorded. "Mia, who taught you that song?" I asked. She shrugged, her expression distant. "The lady," she said simply. My stomach nodded. "What lady?" "The lady in white," she said, looking at me as if I was the silly one for not knowing. Tom dismissed it as a kid's imagination, but I was rattled. I stayed up long after everyone else had gone to bed, sitting by the fire with a flashlight. I kept thinking I saw something in the trees. Shadows that shifted, shapes that moved too quickly to be human. The forest felt alive, watching. And then I heard it again. The whisper. "Sarah?" This time, it was unmistakable. I grabbed the flashlight and swept the beam across the trees. Nothing. The third day was the breaking point. Mia was up before dawn, drawing strange symbols in the dirt around our tent. Swirls, spirals, and jagged lines crisscrossed in a chaotic pattern. "Mia, where did you learn to do this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She looked at me with wide, innocent eyes. "The lady showed me," she said. "She says we have to finish it before it's too late." I grabbed her by the shoulders. "Mia, stop this. Now." She stared at me for a long moment, then nodded and walked back into the tent. Tom found an old journal near an abandoned hiker's pack on the trail that afternoon. The entries were frantic, detailing encounters with a witch spirit that cursed the mountain. The writer described seeing children drawn to her, their souls consumed to keep her tethered to this world. Tom read it aloud like it was a spooky campfire story, but I felt sick. "We need to leave," I said. "Today." Tom started to argue, but Lucas cut him off. "Dad, Mom's right," he said, his voice trembling. "There's something wrong here." Oh. As we packed up, the atmosphere grew heavier, like the air was pressing down on us. Shadows darted between the trees, and the whispering became a constant drone. I kept Mia close, but she seemed distant, her eyes glassy. Suddenly she bolted. "Mia!" I screamed, chasing after her. I found her standing in a small clearing, clutching the dagger we'd found. She was laughing softly, her voice not her own. "She's here," Mia said, her gaze fixed on something behind me. I turned slowly and saw her, the lady in white. She was emaciated, her skin stretched tightly over her bones. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "Leave," she hissed, her voice like dry leaves rustling, "or your daughter stays." Tom arrived, panting, and froze when he saw the figure. "What do we do?" he whispered. I remembered the journal. The ritual. "Lucas, get the journal," I shouted. He ran back to the campsite as the lady stepped closer. She raised a skeletal hand, and the ground around us began to churn, the symbols Mia had drawn glowing faintly. Lucas returned with the journal, and I read aloud the instructions for the ritual. It involved burning sage, something we luckily had in our supplies, and using the dagger to sever the tether. As Tom lit the sage, I grabbed the dagger from Mia's limp hand. She began to convulse, her eyes rolling back as the lady screamed in fury. The sound was unbearable, like nails on a chalkboard, and the air around us grew icy. With trembling hands, I carved the symbols into the dirt as instructed, chanting the words from the journal. The lady lunged at me, but the sage's smoke seemed to repel her. Finally, I drove the dagger into the center of the pattern, and the lady let out an ear-piercing shriek before vanishing in a blinding flash of light. Mia collapsed, unconscious but breathing. The forest fell silent. The oppressive weight lifted. We didn't say a word as we packed up and left the mountain, driving straight home. Even now, weeks later, I still hear the whispers sometimes, faint but unmistakable. And sometimes when Mia hums absent-mindedly, it's that same tune. The lady in white might be gone, but I'm not sure her curse ever truly left us. My name is Jason Reed, and I'm 33 years old. This happened in the summer of 2022 when I decided to hike the Lost Coast Trail in California to clear my head after my divorce. It wasn't my first choice for a trip. I'm more of a city guy. But after the papers were signed, I needed to get away from the noise and my constant need to check my phone. I wanted peace, isolation, and maybe even a sense of accomplishment. What I got was something else entirely. I arrived at the Mattole Beach trailhead on a cloudy Wednesday afternoon. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a single RV parked at the edge. I parked my car, pulled my pack out of the trunk, and double-checked my supplies. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, plenty of food, water filter, GPS, and a satellite phone. I wasn't exactly Bear Grylls, but I thought I'd come prepared. As I adjusted the straps on my pack, a man and woman in their 40s stepped out of the RV. The man, Ethan, was tall and wiry, with a weathered face that suggested he'd spent years outdoors. Carla, his wife, was shorter and wore a permanent frown, as if she disapproved of the entire world. They introduced themselves and asked if I was hiking alone. "Yeah," I replied, "just me." Carla's frown deepened. "You sure about that?" she asked. "People disappear out here sometimes. Storms, landslides, freak accidents." "Carla," Ethan interrupted. "Don't scare the guy." I laughed nervously and assured them I'd be fine. Ethan shrugged and offered a final piece of advice. "Stay on the marked trail, and if the fog rolls in, stop moving. You don't want to get turned around." I thanked him, though his words stuck with me as I started down the trail. The coastline was stunning. Jagged cliffs plunging into the Pacific, waves crashing against the rocks, and seals barking in the distance. For the first few hours, it was everything I'd hoped for. Peaceful, quiet, and exactly what I needed. That night, I set up camp on a small patch of sand near the dunes. The wind howled, and my cheap tent flapped violently, but I managed to get it secured. After dinner, I sat outside and watched the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I felt something I hadn't in months, calm, but that calm didn't last. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of heavy breathing. My heart leapt into my throat. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I listened, it grew louder, labored, uneven. I unzipped my tent and shone my flashlight outside. Nothing, just the wind and the waves. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next day, I chalked it up to nerves. First solo trip, after all. But as I hiked deeper into the wilderness, that unease followed me. The trail wound through dense forests and rocky cliffs with no sign of another human for miles. My GPS worked fine at first, but by late afternoon it started acting up. It showed I was looping back to areas I'd already passed, even though I was certain I was going the right way. That's when I met Maggie. I'd just stopped to rest by a creek when she appeared, stepping out of the trees as if she'd been there the whole time. She was younger than me, maybe in her late 20s, with a battered pack and a confident stride. "Trail gets weird around here, huh?" she said, grinning. "Yeah," I replied, relieved to see another person. "Thought I was losing my mind for a second." She laughed. "You're not, but this place, it's tricky. You hiking alone?" I nodded, and her smile faded. "Careful," she said. "This trail has its ghosts." "Ghosts?" She shrugged. "Something like that. Stay on the trail, and don't hike after dark. They don't like it when you're alone." "Who's they?" Maggie hesitated, then shook her head. "Just be careful." She shouldered her pack and disappeared into the trees before I could ask anything else. That night, I camped in a forested area farther from the coast. It was quieter than the dunes, with no wind to rattle my tent, but the silence felt oppressive. As I lay in my sleeping bag, I thought about Maggie's words. Ghosts? I didn't believe in that kind of thing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a faint scratching sound outside my tent. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the noise. The beam caught something. A pale, human-like figure crouched just beyond the edge of the light. Its skin was translucent, stretched tightly over its bones, and its eyes were hollow, black pits. It moved with jerky, unnatural motions, retreating into the darkness as soon as the light hit it. I froze, unable to breathe. The figure didn't move closer, but it didn't leave either. It just lingered at the edge of the light, watching. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to speak. "Who's there?" My voice came out hoarse and shaky. The figure didn't reply. Instead, it let out a low guttural growl before slipping into the shadows. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I considered turning back, but pride got the better of me. I told myself it was a hallucination. Maybe I was dehydrated or sleep-deprived. Still, I couldn't shake the memory of those black, hollow eyes. As I hiked, I began noticing more signs that something was wrong. Footprints appeared on the trail ahead of me, though I hadn't seen anyone else all day. Strange symbols were carved into tree trunks, circles, spirals, and jagged lines that looked eerily similar to the ones etched into the rocks back at camp. And then there were the whispers. At first, they were faint, like the wind through the trees, but as the day wore on, they grew louder, clearer. Voices. They called my name. "Jason," they whispered, drawing the syllables out like a taunt. By late afternoon, the fog rolled in. It was thick, almost tangible, wrapping around me like a shroud. My GPS was useless by then, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I was lost. That's when I saw them. The pale figures emerged from the fog, their emaciated bodies swaying unnaturally as they moved closer. There were 3 of them, then 5, then too many to count. Their hollow eyes locked onto me, and I felt a wave of cold dread wash over me. I ran. Branches tore at my clothes and face as I sprinted through the forest, the sound of whispers and heavy footsteps chasing me. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop until I burst onto the beach. The sun was setting, casting the waves in blood-red light. I stumbled toward the water, hoping to put as much distance between myself and the creatures as possible. But they didn't follow me onto the sand. Instead, they stood at the edge of the forest, watching. I spent the night on the beach, huddled inside a hollowed-out driftwood log with my flare gun clutched in my hands. I didn't sleep, didn't dare close my eyes. The whispers faded with the dawn, and by the time the sun rose, the figures were gone. I made it back to the trailhead by noon. Ethan and Carla were still there, sitting outside their RV. They looked at me with a mix of pity and knowing. "You saw them, didn't you?" Ethan asked. I nodded, too exhausted to speak. "They only come for the ones who are alone," Carla said softly. "That's why we don't camp out here anymore." I left without another word. It's been months since that trip, but the memories haunt me. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night to faint whispers, and when I close my eyes I see those hollow black pits staring back at me. I don't know what those things were, or why they chose me, but I do know one thing. I'll never hike alone again. My name is Claire Daniels, and I'm 28 years old. This happened in October 2022, during what was supposed to be a dream trip to Joshua Tree National Park. I had just quit my dead-end job and decided to focus on photography, something I'd always loved but never pursued seriously. I thought this trip would be the start of a new chapter. I couldn't have been more wrong. Joshua Tree seemed like the perfect place to begin. Its alien landscape, gnarled trees, massive boulders, endless desert, felt otherworldly, like stepping onto another planet. My plan was simple: spend 3 nights photographing the stars, the sunrise, and the bizarre rock formations that made the park famous. I wanted to capture the beauty of isolation. Instead, I found something else. I arrived late in the afternoon and parked my RV in a small, secluded campsite I'd found online. It was farther from the main park areas, perfect for avoiding crowds. As I stepped out, the desert heat hit me like a wall. The silence was deafening. No birds, no wind, nothing but the crunch of my boots on the dry ground. An old van was parked at the next site over. Its owner, a wiry woman with short, dyed green hair, waved as I walked past. "You here alone?" she called. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound confident. She frowned. "Be careful out here. Desert gets weird after dark." She gave me a lopsided grin, but her tone wasn't joking. That first night, I set up my tripod near a crumbling structure not far from camp. A homestead, maybe a century old. The wooden walls were warped, and the roof had caved in, but it made for a striking silhouette against the twilight sky. As the stars came out, I clicked away, excited by the sharpness of my shots. This was going to be my best work yet. Around midnight, I heard it, a whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind sliding through the cracks of the homestead, but then I heard my name. Claire. I froze, my finger hovering over the shutter button. It was faint, almost too soft to hear, but it was there. I spun around, shining my flashlight across the empty desert. Nothing. The whisper came again, clearer this time, stretching out my name like a taunt. Clairee. I packed up and rushed back to the RV, my pulse hammering in my ears. I told myself it was just my imagination. Probably the wind or the sound of a distant coyote, but I locked the doors before crawling into bed. The next morning, I woke early and decided to explore the homestead ruins in daylight. The whispering was easy to dismiss in the sunlight, and I was determined to prove to myself that there was nothing to fear. The structure was even more decrepit up close, the wood bleached white by the desert sun. A rusted, broken sign leaned against one corner. Hope Springs Homestead. Inside, I found scraps of old furniture, shattered glass, and something that made my skin crawl. A leather-bound journal wedged between the boards of the wall. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink smudged but still legible. The entries were written in a looping, frantic script, describing a family that had tried to make a life here in the 1930s. They'd run out of water during a drought. Their crops had failed, and one by one, they succumbed to starvation or madness. I snapped a few photos of the journal before tucking it back into the wall. As I left the ruins, I noticed something strange. My footprints were the only ones in the sand, but they weren't alone. Another set, smaller and barefoot, trailed alongside mine. That evening, I returned to the homestead to photograph the sunset. The light turned the desert into a surreal painting, the rocks glowing orange and pink, the Joshua trees casting long, jagged shadows. I set up my camera and lost myself in the beauty of it. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the whispers returned. They were louder now, more insistent. "Claire, help us. Claire, come back." The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, slipping between the cracks of my thoughts. I spun around, and for a moment I saw them. Figures, faint and flickering like mirages. A man in a wide-brimmed hat, a woman clutching a baby, a young boy holding a bucket. Their faces were pale, hollow, and desperate. They vanished as quickly as they'd appeared. I grabbed my camera and bolted for the RV, my heart pounding. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers grew louder, circling the RV like predators. The air inside grew stiflingly hot, and I felt the vehicle tremble as if something was pushing against it. When dawn finally broke, the voices stopped. I should have left then, but I couldn't. I needed to know what was happening. The logical part of my brain demanded answers, and the photographer in me was too stubborn to give up the opportunity to capture something truly extraordinary. On the third day, I returned to the homestead, this time with the journal in hand. I flipped to the last entry, dated August 1934. "There is no water, no food. We have prayed for deliverance, but the desert does not hear us. The shadows have come to take us, and I can hear them whispering. They say we will never leave." I didn't notice the shadows at first. They crept in slowly, pooling in the corners of the ruins until the sunlight dimmed unnaturally. The air turned cold, and the whispers became a deafening chorus. My flashlight flickered and died. Then I saw him. The man in the wide-brimmed hat stood in the doorway, his form flickering like a faulty projection. His eyes were dark pits, and his mouth stretched into a jagged, impossible grin. "Leave," he said, his voice reverberating like a growl. "This is my land." I stumbled back, clutching the journal like a talisman. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I didn't mean to." He lunged. I ran, the whispers chasing me, clawing at my mind. By the time I reached the RV, my chest was heaving and my vision blurred with tears. I slammed the door shut and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I gunned it down the dirt road, not caring about the rocks and potholes. But he wasn't finished with me. As I drove, the man appeared in the passenger seat, his flickering form leaning closer. His breath was ice on my skin. "You can't escape," he hissed. "The desert doesn't let you go." I screamed and swerved, the RV skidding to a stop. Grabbing my camera, I turned and snapped a photo, the flash blinding us both. The man vanished, leaving only the faint scent of dust and decay. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station outside the park. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pump the gas. When I reviewed the photos later, my stomach turned. In every shot, the man was there, standing in the shadows watching. I've never returned to Joshua Tree, but sometimes late at night I hear whispers outside my apartment. And when I sleep, I dream of the desert, the homestead, the journal, and the man in the wide-brimmed hat waiting for me to come back. Shadows of the Serrano. My name is Aaron Parker, and I was 24 years old when this happened. I remember the date vividly. October 15th, a Friday night. My friends and I had driven out to Blackstar Canyon in Southern California for what was supposed to be a fun, spooky camping trip. I'd always been fascinated by urban legends and ghost stories, and Blackstar Canyon had its fair share. What none of us knew that night was how horrifyingly real those stories could be. It was my idea, of course. "It'll be fun," I told them, "a haunted canyon, an overnight camp under the stars. It's perfect for October." My boyfriend Chris reluctantly agreed, mostly because he didn't want me going alone. Mia, my best friend, was the cautious one, and she made her discomfort known from the start. Then there was Derek, Chris's best friend, who brushed off every warning with his usual cocky grin. We parked at the trailhead just before sunset. The weather was clear, but a light fog lingered low in the valley. Chris loaded up the gear, our tent, some sleeping bags, and a small cooler, and double-checked the GPS. "We need to stick to the marked trails," he said. "This place is notorious for people getting lost." Derek snorted. "Come on, man. It's a canyon, not the Bermuda Triangle." I shot Derek a glare. "Seriously, Derek, don't be a jerk." Maya stayed quiet, but I could see her unease growing as we started the hike. She had that look, the one where her eyebrows pinched together and her lips tightened into a thin line. "What's wrong?" I asked her as we walked. "Nothing," she said quickly. "Just, this place feels weird." I didn't press her, but part of me felt it too. The deeper we went into the canyon, the quieter it became. No birds, no crickets, just the sound of our footsteps crunching on dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The trail twisted and turned through dense oak trees, their gnarled branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. We reached our campsite just as the last light faded. Setting up the tent was a nightmare. Derek had brought a cheap, flimsy one, and one of the poles snapped while Chris tried to assemble it. "Great," Chris muttered, his patience clearly wearing thin. "This is why I said we should have brought my tent." "It'll be fine," Derek said with a shrug. "It's just one night." I tried to lighten the mood. "At least we're not sleeping under the stars," I joked. No one laughed. By the time we had the tent standing, barely, the fog had thickened, curling around the trees like smoke. We built a small fire, and as the flames danced, I felt a bit of the tension ease. We roasted hot dogs, told ghost stories, and even managed a few laughs. For a moment, it almost felt like the fun trip I'd promised. Then we heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound drifting through the trees. It was low and melodic, like chanting or singing, but the words were unintelligible. We all froze, listening. "What the hell is that?" Mia whispered. Chris frowned, straining to hear. "Probably just the wind." Derek smirked. "Or ghosts." "Stop it," Mia snapped, her voice sharp. "I'm serious, Derek." "Relax," he said, waving her off. "It's nothing." But it didn't feel like nothing. The sound faded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a heavy silence. None of us said it out loud, but we all felt it. Something wasn't right. That night, I barely slept. The tent was cramped, the fog muffled everything, and every sound outside made my heart race. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps circling the tent, slow, deliberate steps crunching on dry leaves. I held my breath, but when I nudged Chris, he mumbled something about raccoons and rolled over. I told myself it was my imagination. The next morning, we found footprints around the campsite. They were human-shaped, but oddly large, with long, narrow toes that dug deep into the soil. Chris knelt down to examine them. His brow furrowed. "They're not fresh," he said. "Probably just some hikers who passed through." Mia crossed her arms. "At night? In the middle of nowhere?" "Let it go," Derek said, already packing up his gear. "You're overthinking." But Mia wasn't overthinking, and I knew it. Something was wrong here. We decided to explore deeper into the canyon that day. Chris brought the map, and I carried a small backpack with water and snacks. The fog was thinner, but the air felt heavy, like the atmosphere before a storm. As we hiked, we came across strange things. A rusted knife half buried in the dirt, shards of pottery scattered near an old oak tree, and a carved stone with crude symbols etched into its surface. Mia stopped in her tracks, staring at the stone. "What do you think this means?" "It's probably just graffiti," I said, though I didn't believe it. Chris shook his head. "It's not graffiti. These look ancient." "Cool," Derek said, pulling out his phone. "Let's take some pics." Before anyone could stop him, Derek picked up the stone to pose with it. That's when the chanting started again, louder this time, closer. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, a haunting, guttural melody that made my skin crawl. "Put it down," Mia hissed. Derek rolled his eyes but set the stone back on the ground. The chanting stopped. By the time we returned to camp, the sun was setting again. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were scared. The footprints, the chanting, the strange artifacts, it all felt too deliberate, too sinister. Chris suggested packing up and leaving, but Derek refused. "We came out here for a haunted adventure, right? Don't chicken out now." "We should have left hours ago," Mia muttered. I agreed with her, but something kept me from speaking up. Maybe it was pride, or maybe I didn't want to admit I'd dragged us into something we couldn't handle. That night, the horror truly began. Around midnight, Derek woke us, his voice shaking. "There's someone out there," he whispered. We scrambled out of our sleeping bags, peering into the darkness. The fog had returned, thicker than before, and shadows moved between the trees. Tall, hunched figures with grotesque, elongated limbs. My stomach churned. They weren't just shadows. They were real. Chris grabbed a flashlight and aimed it at the woods. The beam cut through the fog, landing on one of the figures. It froze, its pale, scarred face turning toward us. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers, and its lips curled into a snarl. "Run," Chris said, his voice trembling. "Now." We bolted, leaving the tent and most of our gear behind. The figures moved with an unnatural speed, flanking us on either side. Their guttural voices filled the air, a sickening mix of laughter and growls. Derek was the first to fall. He tripped over a root, landing hard on his back. I turned just in time to see one of the creatures pounce, its clawed hands pinning him down. His screams echoed through the canyon as we ran. The three of us didn't stop until we reached a clearing. My chest burned and my legs felt like jelly, but adrenaline kept me moving. Chris checked the map, his hands shaking. "We're close to an old mission site," he said. "If we can make it there, we might be safe." "What about Derek?" I asked, tears streaming down my face. Chris didn't answer. The mission ruins were barely standing, a crumbling stone wall and a few scattered pillars, but it was enough to give us some cover. We huddled together, our backs to the wall, listening for the creatures. The fog pressed in, thick and suffocating. My pulse pounded in my ears. "They're toying with us," Mia whispered, "like hunters." "Then we fight," Chris said, picking up a jagged piece of stone. "We don't have a choice." The creatures came at dawn, just as the fog began to lift. There were at least 5 of them, their bodies twisted and grotesque, their eyes glowing like coals. Chris fought valiantly, swinging his makeshift weapon and shouting for us to run. Mia and I hesitated, but he pushed us away. "Go," he yelled. "I'll hold them off." We ran. I didn't look back, even when I heard Chris's screams. By some miracle, we stumbled upon a park ranger station as the sun rose. I collapsed on the porch, sobbing, as Mia pounded on the door. The ranger who answered looked startled, but he didn't question us. He called for backup, and soon we were surrounded by authorities. When I led them back to the campsite, everything was gone. No tent, no footprints, no sign of Derek or Chris. The ruins were empty, the symbols faded. The authorities chalked it up to a bear attack or a group hallucination, but I knew the truth. I still hear the chanting sometimes in my dreams. And when I close my eyes, I see those glowing eyes in the fog, waiting, watching. If you ever visit Blackstar Canyon, remember this. Some legends aren't just stories, they're warnings. My name is Jack Moreno. I was 32 years old when this happened, and I've never been the same since. It was March 12th, a year to the day after the accident that took my fiancée Lauren. I told myself I was heading to Joshua Tree National Park for the surreal desert landscapes and quiet isolation, hoping to rediscover my creative spark as a photographer. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about photography. I wanted to escape the crushing guilt I felt every day since she died. The road to Joshua Tree stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the arid California desert. My RV rattled with every bump, the old engine groaning under the weight of its years. I glanced over at the passenger seat, a habit I hadn't broken in the past year. It used to be Lauren's spot, where she'd read road maps or snack on trail mix while we chatted about everything and nothing. Now, it sat empty, a constant reminder of what I'd lost. By the time I reached the park, the sun had begun to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. I pulled into a remote campsite in the eastern part of the park, where the trails were less crowded. I'd chosen it for the isolation, no distractions, just me and the desert. After parking, I stepped out to stretch, the crisp desert air biting at my skin as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the jagged rocks. The first night was quiet, almost eerily so. The RV's generator hummed faintly, the only sound in the vast emptiness. I cooked a simple dinner, set up my camera gear, and reviewed my plans for the next day. The stars above were brilliant, but I couldn't shake a feeling of unease, as though the silence was pressing in too tightly. I chalked it up to being alone and tried to shake it off. But as I lay in bed that night, the unease grew. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic knocking. 3 quick taps, then silence. I froze, my heart racing. The sound came again, louder this time. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the RV door, my pulse pounding in my ears. And when I swung the door open, the night greeted me with nothing but darkness. No wind, no movement. Just the oppressive silence of the desert. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but the beam revealed only rocks and scrub brush. Shaking my head, I closed the door and locked it. "You're just hearing things," I muttered to myself. The next day, I packed up my camera and headed out to explore the trails. The desert was beautiful in its starkness, the boulders rising like ancient monuments against the clear blue sky. I lost myself in my work, capturing the way the light and shadows played across the rugged terrain. But by late afternoon, as I set up my tripod near a rocky outcrop, I noticed something odd. A figure was walking along the road in the distance, far from any trail. I adjusted my lens to zoom in, expecting to see another hiker. Instead, I saw nothing. The road was empty. I frowned and looked up from my camera. There it was again, a pale figure, standing still this time, facing me. I blinked, and it was gone. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to focus. The desert plays tricks on your eyes, I told myself. Still, I packed up my gear earlier than planned and headed back to the RV. That night, the real terror began. I was reviewing the day's photos when I heard it again, the knocking. 3 quick taps, this time from the passenger side of the RV. My throat tightened. I turned slowly, my eyes fixed on the passenger seat. And that's when I saw her. A woman was sitting there, her face pale and gaunt, her clothes tattered. Her eyes, oh God, her eyes, were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck the air out of the room. My body locked up, paralyzed with fear. She opened her mouth, and though her lips barely moved, I heard her voice as clearly as if she were shouting, "Why did you leave me, Jack?" It was Lauren's voice. I jolted upright, gasping for breath, the passenger seat empty again. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. A nightmare? A hallucination? I grabbed my flashlight and searched the RV, desperate to convince myself it wasn't real. But as I scanned the windows, I saw a shadow move outside. Grabbing my keys, I decided I couldn't stay here another second. I started the RV and drove, the narrow desert road winding under the pale light of the moon. The headlights cut through the fog that had suddenly appeared, swirling like smoke. But the further I drove, the worse it got. The fog thickened until I could barely see 5 feet ahead. Then, out of nowhere, the engine sputtered and died. The RV rolled to a stop, the silence deafening. I tried the ignition again, but it wouldn't turn over. And then I saw her. She stood in the middle of the road, her figure illuminated by the weak glow of my headlights. She wasn't alone. Behind her, shadows began to take shape. Distorted figures with elongated limbs and faces that seemed to shift in and out of focus. The woman stepped closer, her movements unnatural, jerky, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. Her voice echoed inside my head, drowning out my thoughts. "You can't leave me, Jack. You belong here." I scrambled for my camera, desperate to document what I was seeing. The flash went off, and for a brief moment the figures recoiled, their forms flickering like a weak signal on a TV. I grabbed my bag and fled the RV, running blindly into the desert. My legs burned as I stumbled over rocks and brush, the voices of the figures growing louder behind me. They were laughing now, a guttural, mocking sound that made my skin crawl. Eventually, I found an old mine shaft, its entrance partially collapsed. I ducked inside, pressing myself against the cold rock walls. My breathing was ragged, my hands trembling as I clutched my camera like a lifeline. The woman appeared at the entrance, her hollow eyes locked on mine. "You can't escape, Jack," she said, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. "You can't outrun what you've done." Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I lifted the camera and fired the flash repeatedly. Each burst of light seemed to push her back, her form distorting and flickering like a dying flame. Finally, with one last flash, she disappeared, her anguished scream echoing into the night. I don't know how long I sat there, trembling in the darkness. When the first light of dawn broke, I stumbled out of the mine and onto the road. A park ranger found me a few hours later, dehydrated and delirious. When I told him what had happened, he gave me a strange look. "People say this place is haunted," he said, "but they're just stories." But they weren't just stories. When I developed my photos from that night, I saw her. In every shot, she was there, standing just behind me, watching. If you ever think about camping alone, remember this. The desert has its secrets, and some of them don't like to be disturbed. My name is Sarah Langley, and I was 29 years old when this happened. It was late September, the tail end of summer, when the forests of Northern California are still dry, and the days are just starting to get shorter. I was on assignment for an environmental magazine, researching a piece on the hidden dangers of national parks. My editor wanted a gritty, real story about the risks of venturing into the wilderness alone. I wanted to prove I could do it, prove to everyone, including myself, that I could handle isolation, adversity, and whatever the forest threw at me. I decided to take my RV deep into Shasta Trinity National Forest. It was remote, vast, and rugged, exactly what I needed to immerse myself in the story. I'd planned to interview some off-the-grid survivalists in the area, document forgotten trails, and maybe even capture some wildlife shots for the article. But I never could have imagined how wrong the trip would go. The drive into the forest was uneventful, at least at first. I'd been on the road for hours, watching the landscape change from the dull browns of highways to the vibrant greens of towering pines and redwoods. My RV wasn't exactly a top-of-the-line machine. It was a second-hand purchase I'd made years ago, but it had always been reliable. I reached a quiet, secluded clearing just off an unmarked dirt road late in the afternoon. The sun hung low, casting long shadows through the trees. After parking, I took a moment to step out and breathe in the crisp forest air. It was so quiet. Too quiet, maybe. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence that settled in my chest like a weight. I spent the first evening setting up camp and organizing my gear. I cooked a simple meal on my propane stove and jotted some notes in my journal. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, the forest seemed to close in around me, the darkness thick and absolute. I locked the RV door before climbing into bed, telling myself it was just a precaution. That night, I woke to a sound. It wasn't loud, just a faint, rhythmic tapping, almost like raindrops on the roof. But when I listened closer, it became clear the sound wasn't coming from above. It was coming from the RV's back door. My stomach churned as I lay frozen in bed, straining to hear. The tapping stopped, replaced by the creak of something brushing against the side of the RV. I forced myself to sit up, grabbed my flashlight, and peered out the small rear window. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been an animal, a curious raccoon, maybe. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling as I packed my camera gear and headed out to explore. The trails here were unmarked, winding through dense foliage and jagged rocks. I took photos of the landscape, pausing occasionally to jot down observations for my article. It was during one of these pauses, as I adjusted my tripod, that I saw it. A small structure nestled between the trees in the distance. At first, I thought it was a cabin, but as I drew closer, I realized it was a hunting lodge, old, weathered, and long abandoned. Its wooden walls were gray with age, and the windows were shattered, their jagged edges glinting in the dappled sunlight. Curiosity got the better of me. I approached cautiously, noting the deep claw marks gouged into the doorframe and walls. Inside, the air was thick and musty, the floor littered with rotting furniture and scraps of paper. On one table I found an old leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. The entries described a man's slow descent into paranoia. He wrote about hearing voices in the forest, seeing strange figures at night, and being unable to leave the area no matter how far he walked. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. It's watching me now. It knows I'm here. I can hear it breathing. I left the lodge quickly, the journal clutched in my hands. By the time I made it back to the RV, the sun was already sinking low. I felt a sudden urgency to leave, but as I started the engine, a sickening grinding sound filled the air. I cursed under my breath and tried again, but the engine sputtered and died. A quick inspection revealed a coolant leak, and my spare supplies wouldn't be enough to fix it. I was stranded. I locked myself inside the RV that night, my nerves frayed. Every noise outside made me jump. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the faintest whisper of movement. Then came the tapping again. This time, it was at the window. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the glass, tall, skeletal, with glowing eyes that burned like embers. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided to hike out of the forest to find help. I packed a small bag with water, snacks, and my flare gun, leaving the RV behind. The trails seemed different now, less defined, as if the forest itself was shifting to confuse me. Hours passed, and the uneasy feeling grew. I began to hear whispers, faint and indistinct, carried on the wind. When I stopped to rest, I heard my own voice calling out, "Sarah, this way." My blood turned to ice. I turned in every direction, but I was alone. Or so I thought. That's when I saw it. A gaunt, emaciated figure standing at the edge of the trail, its limbs too long, its body covered in tattered, matted fur. Antler-like protrusions jutted from its head, casting jagged shadows on the ground. Its glowing eyes locked onto mine, and I felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. I don't remember running, but I must have, because I found myself back at the abandoned lodge. I stumbled inside, slamming the door behind me. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath. The air inside was colder now, and the claw marks on the walls seemed deeper, more deliberate. The creature was outside. I could hear it circling the lodge, its guttural breathing growing louder. I clutched the flare gun tightly, my only defense. The journal lay open on the table, as if waiting for me. On the last page, new words had appeared, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "It feeds on fear, don't run." I didn't have time to process the message. The door creaked, and I turned just as the creature slammed against it, its claws splintering the wood. It let out a shriek that rattled my skull, its glowing eyes peering through the crack it had made. Desperate, I fired the flare gun. The bright burst of light blinded the creature momentarily, and I used the chance to escape. I ran blindly through the forest, the flare gun clutched in one hand, my flashlight in the other. By some miracle, I found my RV. It was battered and scratched, but the engine roared to life when I turned the key. I sped out of the forest, never looking back, even as I heard the creature's screech echoing through the trees. Back home, I tried to write my article, but I couldn't bring myself to include the truth. No one would believe me. I warned about the dangers of isolation, the importance of preparation, and the respect the wilderness demands. But every time I close my eyes, I see those glowing eyes staring back at me. And in the quiet of the night, when the wind dies down, I sometimes hear it, the tapping. My name is Jack Moreno. I was 32 years old when this happened, and I've never been the same since. It was March 12th, a year to the day after the accident that took my fiancée Lauren. I'd told myself I was heading to Joshua Tree National Park for the surreal desert landscapes and quiet isolation, hoping to rediscover my creative spark as a photographer. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about photography. I wanted to escape the crushing guilt I felt every day since she died. The road to Joshua Tree stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the arid California desert. My RV rattled with every bump, the old engine groaning under the weight of its years. I glanced over at the passenger seat, a habit I hadn't broken in the past year. It used to be Lauren's spot, where she'd read road maps or snack on trail mix while we chatted about everything and nothing. Now, it sat empty, a constant reminder of what I'd lost. By the time I reached the park, the sun had begun to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. I pulled into a remote campsite in the eastern part of the park where the trails were less crowded. I'd chosen it for the isolation. No distractions, just me and the desert. After parking, I stepped out to stretch, the crisp desert air biting at my skin as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the jagged rocks. The first night was quiet, almost eerily so. The RV's generator hummed faintly, the only sound in the vast emptiness. I cooked a simple dinner, set up my camera gear, and reviewed my plans for the next day. The stars above were brilliant, but I couldn't shake a feeling of unease, as though the silence was pressing in too tightly. I chalked it up to being alone and tried to shake it off, but as I lay in bed that night, the unease grew. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic knocking. 3 quick taps, then silence. I froze, my heart racing. The sound came again, louder this time. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the RV door, my pulse pounding in my ears. When I swung the door open, the night greeted me with nothing but darkness. No wind, no movement, just the oppressive silence of the desert. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but the beam revealed only rocks and scrub brush. Shaking my head, I closed the door and locked it. "You're just hearing things," I muttered to myself. The next day, I packed up my camera and headed out to explore the trails. The desert was beautiful in its starkness, the boulders rising like ancient monuments against the clear blue sky. I lost myself in my work, capturing the way the light and shadows played across the rugged terrain. But by late afternoon, as I set up my tripod near a rocky outcrop, I noticed something odd. A figure was walking along the road in the distance, far from any trail. I adjusted my lens to zoom in, expecting to see another hiker. Instead, I saw nothing. The road was empty. I frowned and looked up from my camera. There it was again, a pale figure standing still this time facing me. I blinked, and it was gone. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to focus. The desert plays tricks on your eyes, I told myself. Still, I packed up my gear earlier than planned and headed back to the RV. That night, the real terror began. I was reviewing the day's photos when I heard it again. The knocking. 3 quick taps, this time from the passenger side of the RV. My throat tightened. I turned slowly, my eyes fixed on the passenger seat. And that's when I saw her. A woman was sitting there, her face pale and gaunt, her clothes tattered. Her eyes, oh God, her eyes, were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck the air out of the room. My body locked up, paralyzed with fear. She opened her mouth, and though her lips barely moved, I heard her voice as clearly as if she were shouting. "Why did you leave me, Jack?" It was Lauren's voice. I jolted upright, gasping for breath, the passenger seat empty again. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. A nightmare? A hallucination? I grabbed my flashlight and searched the RV, desperate to convince myself it wasn't real. But as I scanned the windows, I saw a shadow move outside. Grabbing my keys, I decided I couldn't stay here another second. I started the RV and drove, the narrow desert road winding under the pale light of the moon. The headlights cut through the fog that had suddenly appeared, swirling like smoke. But the further I drove, the worse it got. The fog thickened until I could barely see 5 feet ahead. Then, out of nowhere, the engine sputtered and died. The RV rolled to a stop, the silence deafening. I tried the ignition again, but it wouldn't turn over. And then I saw her. She stood in the middle of the road, her figure illuminated by the weak glow of my headlights. She wasn't alone. Behind her, shadows began to take shape. Distorted figures with elongated limbs and faces that seemed to shift in and out of focus. The woman stepped closer, her movements unnatural, jerky, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. Her voice echoed inside my head, drowning out my thoughts. "You can't leave me, Jack. You belong here." I scrambled for my camera, desperate to document what I was seeing. The flash went off, and for a brief moment the figures recoiled, their forms flickering like a weak signal on a TV. I grabbed my bag and fled the RV, running blindly into the desert. My legs burned as I stumbled over rocks and brush, the voices of the figures growing louder behind me. They were laughing now, a guttural, mocking sound that made my skin crawl. Eventually, I found an old mine shaft, its entrance partially collapsed. I ducked inside, pressing myself against the cold rock walls. My breathing was ragged, my hands trembling as I clutched my camera like a lifeline. The woman appeared at the entrance, her hollow eyes locked on mine. "You can't escape, Jack," she said, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. "You can't outrun what you've done." Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I lifted the camera and fired the flash repeatedly. Each burst of light seemed to push her back, her form distorting and flickering like a dying flame. Finally, with one last flash, she disappeared, her anguished scream echoing into the night. I don't know how long I sat there, trembling in the darkness. When the first light of dawn broke, I stumbled out of the mine and onto the road. A park ranger found me a few hours later, dehydrated and delirious. When I told him what had happened, he gave me a strange look. "People say this place is haunted," he said, "but they're just stories." But they weren't just stories. When I developed my photos from that night, I saw her. In every shot, she was there, standing just behind me, watching. If you ever think about camping alone, remember this: the desert has its secrets, and some of them don't like to be disturbed.